of people. Israel is now allowing humanitarian aid into Gaza through Egypt following a visit from President Biden. The US is backing Israel's claim that a rocket was fired by a group inside the territory, while Hamas has claimed the Israeli Defence Force is behind the attack. Prime Minister Rishi Sunak says UK intelligence teams are working to find out the truth.
It is important in this instance not to jump to conclusions. We have to establish the facts, and premature speculation, I think, would be wrong, and that's not the right thing. This is a very heightened, sensitive situation, so we just need calm heads.
A paedophile who abducted a young girl in the Scottish borders and sexually abused her has been jailed for 20 years. Andrew Miller was told by a judge his attack was every parent's worst nightmare. Greta Thunberg has been charged with a public order offence after a protest in central London. 26 people were arrested following a demonstration outside a meeting of major oil and gas companies yesterday. In the city, the FTSE 100 has closed down 87 points at 75.88. The pound buys $1.21 and €1.15. LBC weather, Storm Babbitt moving further south with heavy and persistent rain, dry in northern Scotland with showers in the southwest overnight, a low of 6. From Global's newsroom for LBC, I'm Charlotte Morgan.
This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation. Cross Question with Iain Dale.
2 minutes past 8 on LBC. Welcome to Wednesday's Cross Question. We have a bit of a wet panel tonight, or at least two members have professed to have been caught in a downpour, but they are here and they're willing to answer your questions on any subject you like. The number to call 0345 6060 973. You can text 84850 and say, Alexa, send a comment to LBC, and you can watch us on Global Player. I'm not going to tell you which are the two wettest members of the panel. You can watch us work it out for yourself. We have Lord Karan Bilimoria with us, crossbench peer, founder and chairman of Cobra beer, and vice president of the Confederation of British Industry, the CBI. Christine Jardine is Liberal Democrat MP for Edinburgh West. She's the party spokesperson for the Cabinet Office, Women and Equalities and Scotland. Rabbi Dr. Jonathan Romain is minister of Maidenhead Synagogue in Berkshire, who's the author of the book The Naked Rabbi and the chair of the Assisted Dying campaign group Dignity in Dying. And Steve Norris is with us, former Conservative minister and former London mayoral candidate. So they're here to answer your questions. Get dialing 0345 6060 973.
Call 0345 6060 973. Tweet at LBC. Text 84850. Cross Question with Iain Dale. This is LBC.
Let's go to our first caller. It's David in Bayswater. David, hi. What would you like to ask?
Hi, Iain and panel. I wanted to ask, is it right that the US vetoed a UN resolution today calling for a temporary ceasefire to allow humanitarian aid? And it's the 54th time they've done this, the UN resolutions condemning Israel.
Well, Brazil, which holds the presidency of the UN Security Council at the moment, has proposed a humanitarian pause to the fighting to allow for aid to be delivered to Gaza. However, the US vetoed the motion, while the UK and Russia both abstained. The US ambassador to the UN says Washington wants to allow more time for the Biden administration's diplomacy in the Middle East to play out. Jonathan Romain.
Well, there's a very simple solution, and that is Hamas should give the hostages back. And Israel's made it very clear that if they get their hostages back, these are civilian hostages, they weren't military, they didn't attack military depots, they just attacked, as you well know from the Hamas videos themselves, women and children. And Israel said, give them back, and that's what we want. And of course, although they have... in fact, I believe the news is they have now allowed humanitarian aid as of this evening. And that is going to go through the Egyptian border, which, by the way, shatters another myth that the Gaza is completely cut off. It has a border with Egypt. Now, to be honest, Egypt has closed it up till now, and you have to ask yourself why a fellow Arab, fellow Muslim state is closing it to Hamas. Presumably, they think Hamas is pretty awful, and they don't want them infiltrating Egypt either. But there is humanitarian aid going through this evening, and it will flow much more freely if the hostages are returned. And, you know, it's very simple. Hamas can free the hostages that should never have been taken in the first place.
If Hamas agreed to do that, do you think there would be calls for Israel to have to guarantee that there would be no ground invasion?
I think Israel would love not to have a ground invasion. I mean, the problem is it's not a sort of open battle like we're used to in perhaps the Second World War or whatever.
No.
They're going street to street, house to house. The Israeli casualties will be enormous, quite apart from the civilian casualties who are caught up in the fighting. And one of the other tragedies is that Hamas deliberately positions its munitions and its headquarters within civilians. I mean, this hospital, now we don't quite know who was responsible for it, but what I did hear on the radio was a Palestinian saying, we went to the hospital because we thought it was safe. Why did they think it was safe? Because they knew that Israel doesn't target hospitals. So, yes, Israel will be only too pleased to take the Hamas leadership out and not to have to go into Gaza. After all, they withdrew in 2005, and Gaza, remember, is not fighting for its freedom. It is already self-governing. What did it do with its self-governing? Up to a point. Yeah. But it is totally controlled by Hamas, who was elected by the Gazan population. They haven't had elections since 2005. That says something else in itself.
OK, Christine Jardine.
I think absolutely that Israel has a right to defend itself, and unless the hostages are released, I think Israel will continue to defend itself. A ceasefire, it would perhaps be good to have a pause to allow the diplomacy to continue, but we know now that the humanitarian aid is going to get in, which is something that we were all very concerned about. But I think we have to remember in this that Israel was attacked in a foul, vicious way. It was civilians who were attacked. And they are defending themselves. The state is defending itself against terrorists. And now that the humanitarian aid is going in, the only question that I think we all want answered and answered immediately, apart from who's responsible for the shell in the hotel, is where are the hostages and why are they not being returned? This has been, I wouldn't say overshadowed or forgotten, but in the last few days, there's been a lot of attention on the humanitarian situation, which is horrific and something needs to be done about it. And the Palestinians, I feel, in this are as much a victim in many ways as the people in Israel who were attacked on the 7th of October. But we have 199 missing hostages. We know that Hamas took people back to Gaza. We don't know where they are. We don't know if they're alive. And some of them are British citizens. So
10, I think.
That needs to be a priority. And I honestly believe that until Israel has those hostages returned, and until they have said today, and I heard again today from an Israeli, they want Hamas out of Gaza. Their argument, they believe, is not with the Palestinian people themselves, it is with Hamas. Hamas does, as we've just heard, it does hide behind civilians and it uses them as a human shield. It has this vast network of tunnels underneath the ground, 300 kilometres of tunnels.
Are they not tunnels as we might think of prison escape tunnel? Are they,
no.
They can take SUVs?
Yeah, it's like the tube under there. I think they call it the metro, in fact. And what Israel wants is Hamas displaced, their hostages back, and the people of Israel want peace as much as the people of Palestine want peace. And I think that's what we have to keep an eye on. My colleague Layla Moran this week spoke very movingly in the comments about the fact that her family, her direct family, are in the West Bank.
And she's half Palestinian.
She's half Palestinian. And some of her family are in Gaza. And she spoke very movingly about the fact that she'd gone, because of that, to a vigil with the Jewish community in Oxford, because she feels that they have now something which kind of almost binds them together. They are both suffering in this and they both want a solution. And I think we need to keep that in our minds as well, that there are two sets of people who need a solution to this, a two-state solution.
Steve Norris.
Well, I don't really have an awful lot to add to what both of our fellow panellists have been saying, because I think it makes enormous sense. I would only add that the real risk for me is that this escalates even further. We know that, for example, the Iranians were very much behind the ability of Hamas to evade what used to be described as the most sophisticated intelligence service in the world, which was, of course, Mossad and the Israeli intelligence service. What's happened is beyond appalling. I agree with absolutely everything that Rabbi said and our colleague about the necessity for Hamas to reveal where the hostages are and indeed to release them. Clearly, whoever committed the atrocities, we don't really know at this stage. It doesn't make them any less appalling. And frankly, the sooner that this de-escalates, and all parties should be keen to impress on, wherever they have influence, the necessity for that to happen, the better.
And do you think that the key to the release of the hostages will be pressure from outside? I mean, the Qataris apparently have relations with Hamas, which slightly fills me with horror, but they do, and they could be the key to this.
Well, that's, of course, a product of the usual Shia-Sunni division within Islam itself. But yes, the Qataris, I think, are a key player in all of this, because clearly I don't see Iran wanting to stop the chaos. As far as they're concerned, this plays exactly into their hands, and they'll regard this whole operation as a great success, which is appalling, but nonetheless it's the political reality. People like the Qataris could be enormously helpful. Of course, what they have is the money.
Karan Bilimoria.
With regard to the UN, by the way, the UN Security Council needs to be reformed. It's way out of date. The 5 permanent members, for example, and any one of them can veto. And India is not a permanent member of the UN Security Council.
How about India replacing Russia?
Well, it's a much bigger economy for a start. So that's one aspect of it. But what we're talking about here, I think we've got to stop every single minute of every day and remember what happened on the 7th of October. I've shown a film today by the Israeli government, and it is horrific. I mean, it's beyond nightmares. How can any human being do what these monsters, these barbaric monsters did in the way that they did to babies, to women, to children, to old people, to Holocaust survivors? It's horrendous. 1,400 people, not just killed, but killed in the most... You cannot imagine it. And we can't forget that. And these hostages who are there, 199 of them, including our citizens, including old people, including Holocaust survivors, including children, this is just unacceptable. And one, the hostages have to be returned straight away. The next thing to remember is Hamas have now been in power since 2005, when Israel said, we're stepping out of here. What have they done in that time? People talked about a Singapore in the area of the Middle East being created. They had the freedom to do it. Instead, all that has happened is it's just been hostility. When I was there with a parliamentary delegation in May, which was the House Floor's delegation to Israel, we spent a whole day on the Gaza border, looking out on the whole of Gaza. All these places where these horrors took place, we were there on the ground. Not once did I feel unsafe. In fact, we were dejected by the political situation in the area, including in Israel, but we did not for 1 minute feel unsafe, because we thought the Israelis were right on top of it. In fact, there were flats in a city, Synagogue, which is right there, balconies overlooking Gaza. Any sniper from Gaza could shoot anyone at any time. In fact, when we were there, they could have shot us at any time. We were not worried one jot. No one saw this coming. Now, when something like this happens, in the time we'd been there, for the 4 weeks before, 1,000 rockets had been fired. And the Iron Dome was working pretty well in stopping most of them. Now, in one day, 5,000 rockets and the horrors that were committed. Hamas can't get away with this. It's not going to go away. So and the worst thing, Hamas and Fatah do not talk to each other. There is no democracy. There have been no elections on the West Bank, the Palestinian Authority, and Hamas. And then you've got Hezbollah in the north as well. And then you've got Iran supposedly financing, backing all this. This is a horrible situation. Israel has to be given the time to do what it has to do.
And the supreme irony here is that the Middle East was sort of inching towards some sort of peace. You know, Israel made peace long ago with Egypt and Jordan. They had the Abrahamic Accords.
I spoke in a debate on the Abraham Accords. And we were so positive just a few weeks ago in the House of Lords. And we were saying the next step is Saudi and Israel. This was wonderful. More trade, more business, more travel, tourism, peace.
But sadly, you wonder how much of that was actually an incentive to the horror.
Deliberately,
deliberately to undermine this.
And that's the dog that hasn't barked in this, isn't it? Why now?
Why now?
Well, I think the key to this is Iran. And it's about time we started to take Iran as seriously as an enemy of every Western democracy and democracy everywhere in the world, as we think of Putin, as we think of Kim Jong-un, as we think to some degree of Xi in China. To me, this is a threat that we've underestimated for years. Actually, there's been quite a lot of military activity, as you probably know, in the Gulf. There's this, taking the point that Karan was making, this didn't get planned overnight. This took months to plan, precisely in order to overwhelm what was otherwise regarded as a sophisticated security screen. And that's, I think, one of the big issues we've got to start tackling, taking Iran much more seriously than we do.
We'll take another question on this wider subject in just a moment here on LBC. It's 8:15.
This is LBC.
Get up to
Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC. Text 84850.
18 minutes past 8 on LBC. We have a very thoughtful panel with us tonight. I don't always say that, but I am going to do that tonight. Lord Bilimoria is with us, Christine Jardine, Liberal Democrat MP, Rabbi Dr. Jonathan Romain, and former Conservative Minister Steve Norris. Let's go to a text question from Sam in Cambridge, who says, does the panel agree that Hamas should allow the UN to assess and identify responsibility for the bombing of the hospital in Gaza? I'm not sure that's a function of the UN, but I mean, it's an idea. Steve Norris.
Well, I'm not even sure it is a practical possibility anyway. I think we know that it was not the Israelis who bombed that hospital, and if that's the case, it's a further example of how Hamas uses its own civilian population to ramp up the outrage that those who support Hamas will now feel they're able to express. I think Karan was talking about just how appalling the impact of the original attack has been, and the kind of people, the kind of evil minds that would ever think of bombing your own citizens in order to kill 400 or 500 of them. From what we understand, I don't know.
I don't think it was. I mean, let's assume it was. Well, they said that it was Islamic Jihad. I don't think anybody's suggesting that it was deliberate. I think a rocket ceased functioning and then dropped on the hospital. That seems to be the theory.
Well, if that's the case, then I've not been able, I'm afraid, to keep up with the latest developments, so you must excuse me. But certainly it wouldn't have surprised me if it had been done, if you like, to make a political point. As it happens, if it is just an appalling consequence of this conflict, it's that bad enough in itself. Do I think the UN has a role? Frankly, no.
Karan?
Well, what people don't realise is these rockets that are fired, now thousands and thousands of them, many of them misfire. The latest statistics are about 12% of them misfire in terms of not getting to where they're meant to get to, and when the 12% fall within Gaza. Now, they could fall in a field before they get to the Israeli border, but sometimes, like this was a mistake, it was fired from the Israeli intelligence, it was fired from a cemetery behind the hospital, and it landed by mistake in the hospital. So I don't think it was intentional, and they've got audio evidence, which I've heard, of Hamas talking to each other and saying it was Islamic Jihad that did it, and it was a mistake that took place. So, and also the damage that has taken place, it's horrible, it's awful, and tragedy is not the same as if Israel had fired a bomb in there from a plane or artillery. And so it is not, Israel have not done this from the evidence. And what this shows us is we cannot jump to any conclusion straight away, because there's a lot of false messaging.
Like the BBC did?
Like a lot of people did. Yes. And they shouldn't do that.
We shouldn't have done that.
And by the way, the BBC and everyone has to refer to these people as terrorists. And not just terrorists, monstrous, barbaric, horrific terrorists, inhuman terrorists.
Even I wouldn't say that a newsreader should go that far. But Jonathan Romain, in a way, the horse has bolted on the PR here, because if people have made up their own minds, and there are a lot of people that whatever the Israelis say, whatever proof they come up with, they just will not believe it. You now get the excuse, well, it couldn't have been an Islamic Jihad or Hamas rocket, because they wouldn't be able to kill 500 people, ignoring the fact that there were loads of people in a sort of taking shelter in one particular place. It wouldn't need to be a massive rocket. But people just seem to revert to their own prejudices, whichever side we're talking on here, don't they?
Yes, and it would be really good if we followed the evidence, not the supposition. And I think
I'm actually rather proud that we did on this programme last
night. Well done, Iain Dale and LBC. But it also shows that Hamas has not only attacked Israel, but it's actually let down its own people, and it's really caused something absolutely suicidal for the Palestinian people. The good news is, and this hasn't come out so far in our discussion, it's very clearly a political battle. It's not a religious war. And I say that because it means that there is actually no need for Jews and Muslims in this country or elsewhere to be at odds with each other. Certainly I've been in touch with local imams, national imams, and we're very adamant that we're not going to bring what happens in the Middle East to England, and that our good relations shall stay.
But we saw the demonstrations that were taking place in Amman, in Turkey, and other parts of the Middle East last night, where everyone assumed, because they all assumed.
We don't want
no, you're right, but they all assumed that Israel must have been to blame. Now, I mean, you can see the logic, I suppose, but they didn't wait, and then they cancelled this summit with President Biden today. And, I mean, these things have consequences.
Yeah, as often... was it Abba Eban who said Palestinians have never missed an opportunity to miss an opportunity? And really, it would have been in their own interest if they'd met with Biden, with his power behind him, with the American, not just military power, but also the financial power. And he could have done much good. Boycotting just never helps. And you've got to talk to your enemies. You don't talk to your friends to achieve things. You've got to talk to your enemies.
Yeah.
Christine?
I was going to say that one of the reasons I think that some of the Arab nations pulled out the talks with Biden was the pressure they were under because of the rioting and the protests in the street, which was a result of the assertion that Israel had bombed a hospital, which we now know is highly unlikely I don't want to be the one who makes the evidence, but I do think we don't need to jump. We shouldn't be jumping to conclusions. And I think one of the most damaging things about jumping to conclusions last night was that it sparked off this reaction. And once you've done that, it's very difficult to claw back from that. And that the pressure that the Arab states would then have been under not to speak to Israel must have been huge. But now, when you look at it, the Americans have investigated and say that, they are confident now that it wasn't the Israelis. Our government is looking at it very, very closely. The last I heard, they didn't think that it was likely that it was the Israelis. And it seems now that a conclusion was jumped to because there was an explosion from a shell in Gaza that it must have come from Israel. And that's not the case. We know that rockets are fired by Hamas and Islamic Jihad from Gaza, and that they misfire. So, the damage that was done by jumping to a conclusion is monumental. And yes, I agree with the Rabbi. The argument shouldn't come here. It shouldn't be between Jews and Muslims in this country, but we are seeing a massive increase in anti-Semitism and Islamophobia.
And to be fair,
we do need to pay attention.
I'm glad you added that, because if you look at the figures, I mean, not just the Community Security Trust. I mean, they've done a lot. We had Dave Rich on last night, but if you talk to the people at Tel Mama, who effectively sort of opposite to them, I mean, they have reported a huge increase in Islamophobic incidents.
And that's what I think is interesting. And I want you to get the chance actually to ask the Prime Minister, yes, money's been put in to security, but are we going to encourage more cooperation between them? Because I think the answer could be there. If we get the CST and Tel Mama to work together, and they seem to want to cooperate, then we can perhaps begin to break this down and recognise that this is not a problem which is only affecting Jews or only affecting Muslims. It's affecting both communities, and it's affecting both Israelis and Palestinians.
And the first phone call I made after phoning some of the bereaved families in my community was to phone the local imam. I knew his name, I knew his phone number, he knew me, and we talked together about how we were going to make sure we...
And do you think that's been replicated across the country?
Yes.
Oh, yes.
Good. Bit of breaking news. The Foreign Office is tonight advising British nationals against all travel to Lebanon and telling UK citizens in that country to leave as soon as possible. Well, that would indicate, and maybe I'm reading too much into this, but of course Hezbollah effectively control most of Lebanon, and if they launched an initiative against northern Israel, well, we are in a very, very different ball game there. There have been lots of pro-Gaza protests in Lebanon today. Right, Hassan is in Cambridge. Hi, Hassan.
Yeah, hello. Hi, Ian. Ian, in the 2019 elections, 86% of the Muslims in the country voted for Labour. Now, they are very disappointed by Starmer's position on the Gaza-Israel crisis, and we've had multiple councillors resigning in protest to Labour policy. What does the panel think will happen to this Muslim vote bank, which could be anything between a million and a half voters who always stuck with Labour?
It has been quite interesting that Keir Starmer has been in some ways more hardline than Rishi Sunak in his reaction to this. It could make a difference, I guess, in some marginal seats as to how Muslim voters vote at the next election. Christine, I don't know if that might affect your seat at all.
I don't know. I think it's too early to say what long-term the reaction is going to be in a general election to what has happened in the past week. I think emotions are running very high at the moment, and people are reacting to the immediate news, and they're reacting right away. What I think we have seen in Parliament, however, is largely unanimity on all the benches about the situation. We have all condemned Hamas. We have all said that Israel has a right to defend itself. And we are all concerned about the humanitarian catastrophe that we have to avoid in Gaza. And I think when it comes to a general election, that will be reflected in the way people vote.
I'm looking at the clock. We're heading towards the news, so I'm going to ask you all to be quite brief on this one.
I would challenge the questioner, because I'm not sure if Muslims voted about Labour's foreign policy. I would have thought they were voting much more on their economic and social policy. And as for Keir Starmer, what has he said? The legitimate defence of a sovereign state and care for civilians. If you're against those two, I'm not sure what your moral compass is.
Well, I think this results from an interview he did on RBC at the Labour conference, in which he said Israel has the right to defend itself how it sees fit, potentially including withholding water and power supplies. So I think that's what people objected to.
Which is withholding water supplies is much better than sending over bombs and missiles. And Israel has not gone in, and not only did they give them 24 hours notice, it's been 4 days now.
Karan?
This should not be about Muslims against Jews. This is a humanity against terrorism. And if we look back at history, look back at 9/11, Al-Qaeda, what did we do? We went in, and it was the only time Article 5 of NATO has been implemented. We destroyed Al-Qaeda. Then after that, you have ISIS. Then you have Hamas. Then you have Islamic Jihad. Then you have Hezbollah. Then you have the IRGC. But Hamas has really come to the fore since 2005. Then you've got the IRGC in Iran that should be prescribed. It is one terrorism after the other. We cannot allow this to continue. This is not to do with Muslims against
Norris.
Jews.
Only to say that I agree with Christian. I think these sort of things are said in the heat of the moment. I don't think it'll make a blind bit of difference come the general election. I was proud of the fact that today the entire House stood together, and that both Starmer and Sunak were absolutely as one. I'm proud of that. I think that was a great day for British democracy.
Hassan, thank you very much for your question. We'll move on to other subjects in just a moment. If you'd like to put a question to our panel, 0345 6060 973. It's 8:31. News headlines on LBC with Charlotte Morgan.
Israel has agreed to allow aid into Gaza from Egypt after a visit from Joe Biden. The US president's backed Israel's denial of involvement in an explosion at a hospital in the territory after Hamas blamed it on an Israeli airstrike. A group of 10 serving and former police officers are being investigated over how allegations against David Carrick were handled. The convicted rapist and former police officer was jailed for at least 30 years in February. And Greta Thunberg will appear in court next month after being charged following a climate protest in central London. In total, 26 activists were arrested outside a hotel in Mayfair where oil and gas companies were meeting. LBC weather, heavy rain for most as Storm Babbitt moves north, drier in northern Scotland with a low of 6.
LBC. Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC.
8:35 on LBC. With us, Lord Bilimoria, Christine Jardine, Rabbi Dr. Jonathan Romain and Steve Norris. Now, let's go to James in Chelsea. James, you have a very different question for us.
Yes, I do, and I'm sorry I'm sort of deviating from the main sort of context of the conversation, but for me it's something very sort of close to my heart. But the man, Andrew Malkinson, that spent 17 years, 4 months, 9 days in prison for a crime that he didn't commit, is living on the street. And I just think that's just totally barbaric. You put a man in prison for 17 years and then you're waiting, he's waiting for his compensation, which isn't going to probably take place for a couple of years. But part of my thinking, and I'm a working class person, part of my thinking was that if he's going to get this, I think a couple of £1 million, maybe a little bit more, maybe a little bit less. But part of my thinking is that if he's going to get this already, why not just give him
Why can't he have an advance?
Why can't he just, have a little lump sum about, okay. Just, I don't know, 100,000.
Well, that sounds very logical. That sounds very logical, James. So just a little background to this. Andrew Malkinson was wrongfully convicted of rape in 2003 and finally freed in July of this year after forensic testing linked another man to the crime. Now, he's having to pursue a civil claim to get compensation for the time he spent locked up and believes this could take 2 years, and he's now living in a tent in Spain. There's something wrong with the system if that is allowed to happen, isn't there, Christine?
Yeah, that's not fair. When someone is wrongly convicted, you have to examine, first of all, what went wrong, but you also have to ensure that you do everything you possibly can to help them re-enter society and do it smoothly and with support. And yes, if he's going to get however much compensation, surely there's a way of giving him an advance on it now. And the other thing about it is, if he spent 17 years in prison, it's not going to be easy to re-enter society and to be able to cope with budgeting every month and getting a lot of money and knowing what to do with it. He needs help and support. And the fact that he hasn't got it, I think, is criminal. We really should have a much better system and much better support in place for people when they're the victim of something like this. In fact, anyone coming out of prison, but particularly if they've been wrongly convicted.
You've been a minister, Steve. If I was Alex Chalk, the Justice Secretary, reading this story today, I would want to take action this day. But if you were yourself in that position, maybe you have been in that position where you've seen something going completely wrong, you've ordered for it to be rectified, but the system doesn't allow it.
Oh, the system is to blame. I mean, we've been very generous so far to the system, because the system, if you remember, was actually shaping up to charge him for the fact that he'd been given free board and lodging for 20 years. Yeah. I mean, that is utterly inhumane. This is an innocent man. Yeah. And yes, I think Alex Chalk should have been on the case the minute he heard about this and said, for God's sake, give the man $1 million straight away. You can argue about the difference, although why it should take 2 years, God knows, because after all, it's a very simple proposition. He was wrongly convicted. He served 20 years, the most important 20 years of his life. Now he's out. He deserves to be thoroughly compensated. I'm not sure money can even do it. No. And I think that's the point that Christie's making. There's all of that terrible emotional and and social sort of interchange that he's missed. Oh, I think this is something that reminds me very much of the way that we seem to have reacted to those poor postmasters and mistresses who were, some of them, convicted when the company itself knew that they were innocent. There are some times in this country when you despair of the way our criminal justice system works, and frankly, this is one of them.
It's not just the criminal justice system, though. We've seen failures in dealing with the infected blood scandal. We're still waiting on that being resolved. decades later. There's something wrong when we can't recognise that someone has been wronged by the system and fix it.
Karan.
Well, this is a pure case of miscarriage of justice.
Yes.
And when it's in such a horrible way, ruining somebody's life, he is due compensation. He will get that compensation. And here's the irony of it. This country is respected around the world as having the fairest system of justice, having the best courts, the best judges, the best lawyers. And this is a question of leadership. And this is where government needs to step in and say, well, the system can be the system. This is not fair. We're going to sort this out now. It takes guts to do that. Hammersmith Bridge, a bridge being closed in the most important city in the world for all these years because of the system of two boroughs not agreeing, whatever it is. This is where leadership, if I were Prime Minister, I'd step in and say, sort that bridge out within months.
And what's the point of being Prime Minister or Justice Secretary if you can't step in and do these things?
Couldn't agree more. Couldn't agree more. I reckon, you go back to one of the few things you can do as a minister is say, well, I don't care what was happening yesterday, we'll do it differently from today. And actually, the blob will try on occasions to correct you if they think that you're wrong, and just occasionally, you even might be. That's when they say...
Well, were you ever wrong, Steve?
I was never wrong, but I was told on occasions that's a very brave decision, Minister, which means you're an idiot. But off you go. No, there's a serious point here. The serious point, I think, both Christine and Karen have summed it up perfectly. This was a dreadful miscarriage of justice. He deserves to be cared for, not just financially compensated. This is, I think, Christine's point is entirely right. He should be cared for, and the state is...
Jonathan.
Yes, and really to get the enormity of the situation, you just have to ask any one of yourselves or any one of the listeners, which of the last 17 years of your life would you like to lose? It's just terrible. And yes, it should be an automatic process, but I would also say there should be some responsibility at the top. Particularly the postman, for instance. It seems to me that the former CEO got away with everything. And same with the blood scandal. Why does the buck... Well, we say the buck stops at the top, but it seems not to.
Deputy heads must roll, Jonathan.
Well, and actually, in the case of the Post, I was particularly irate because the then CEO was actually an Anglican minister. And, where was her love your neighbour as yourself? Where were her religious values, quite apart from her bureaucratic
Honestly, these
skills?
religious people, they're always the worst, aren't they?
Yeah, but I was incensed. When we've all got a local postman who we chat to, and we've got a local post office shop, and they just do a great job, and they're very much part of the communal and the local furniture, now that so many other little local things have disappeared. The post office is the last bastion, really, and they were let down so badly.
The lady you're talking to, its name is Paula Van Els. She got a CBE in 2019 for, wait for it, services to the post office.
Well, you couldn't make it up.
And to charity.
You could not make it up.
And the CWU, the Communications Workers Union, wants that to be stripped from her. Well, all power to their elbow, I would say.
And it was under her watch. It was under her watch that they knew the system.
And I wonder what she's doing now, because if you're one of these people in the health service where you oversee a catastrophic disaster in a hospital trust, a year later you get promoted to a different one.
Yeah.
It happens time and time and time again. Anyway, that's my little rant over. We'll take more of your questions in a moment. Let's go early to a break so we can fit more in the last part of the programme. It's 8:43.
LBC, Nick Ferrari at breakfast.
The Labour MP and Shadow Chief Secretary of the Treasury, Darren Jones, Sir Keir has faced calls to apologise for and retract remarks he made on LBC, saying Israel had the right to withhold water and power. Are those tactics appropriate?
Any action from either side of this war must be done within international law.
You don't pick up on any tension within the party, a wing of it trying to suggest Sir Keir modifies his stance.
Of course, there are representatives of different parts of the country that have different types of constituents. The Labour Party position could not be clearer.
Nick Ferrari at breakfast. Back tomorrow morning from 7. Listen on your radio and on Global Player. LBC.
Honestly.
Leading Britain's conversation. Cross Question with Iain Dale. Tweet at LBC.
8:46. Let's go to a text question from Brian in Newport. Is it inevitable that schemes like the congestion charge and Wales's 20-mile-an-hour speed limit will end up being seen right across the country? Now, the background to this is that a report from the National Infrastructure Commission warns that congested roads and inadequate public transport constrain cities' economic growth and suggests measures such as congestion charging or workplace parking schemes will be needed to deter people from driving into city centres and avoid total gridlock in them. This really gets my goat, this question, because, I mean, why is it that these commissions, their first knee-jerk reaction is to always impose new taxes and charges?
Well, I have to tell you that I've just...
hang on, I wasn't coming to you, Jonathan. Wait your turn. Let's go to former Transport Minister Steve Norris.
For what it's worth, this is not, as always, it's not a simple question. The congestion charge, for example, has no impact whatsoever on congestion in London these days.
It did initially.
Of course it did, but it was always going to be temporary. I remember saying to Ken Livingstone, who I got on with extremely well, incidentally, he's clearly been by far the best mayor we've had in this city so far, by a country mile. I remember saying, the trouble is, Ken, this only works if you don't raise a penny. If you do raise a lot of money, which of course you do, it's because it hasn't worked, because people have simply got used to paying it. And right now, I don't know about you, but I have an account with TfL, which ensures that I've always paid, and it's such a meaningless proposition, really. So you've got to be very careful about thinking that just charging is going to solve the problem. There is a huge issue around the role of public transport, because, you know, I own cars. I used to sell cars.
You did,
and I've owned all sorts of exotic nonsense. But nonetheless, to be serious, I don't use it in London. I absolutely do not use it. I've used the tube always, occasional buses, gets me around much more efficiently. I probably use the tube, I think probably today about 7 times, just going from here to the city to backside, to so on. In a great city like London, that works. But we're very, very bad at providing that kind of connectivity elsewhere. Manchester's got a reasonable system. Birmingham's got a rather limited system. There's not much else in the country if you compare it with continental Europe. Good public transport is the answer to people not even wanting to own a car.
Try getting around Edinburgh.
Yes, but the Edinburgh tram, of course, was a much discussed and much debated proposition. I remember that back in the 90s when either they wanted it or they didn't want it. They couldn't make their mind up, and they couldn't make their mind up about the cost and so on.
And lots of people didn't want it, when the idea of an extension was promoted, wanted it. And now other parts of the city want the tram. Because, like you say, getting about in Edinburgh is almost impossible at times. And there's been a debate about a congestion charge in Edinburgh. But the key is public transport. And to answer the question, I do think it's inevitable that we have schemes like the congestion charge, maybe not the congestion charge itself, but that we have schemes to discourage people from driving in city centres. But that'll take an improvement in public transport. Now, I come from Glasgow originally.
But you don't mention that very much in Edinburgh West.
But when I was growing up in Glasgow, we never took the car.
Where did the accent go?
I don't know, actually. Worse than that, I was born in Glasgow, but I was brought up in Clydebank. And we took the train everywhere because Glasgow has a fantastic transport system. You can take the train, get off the train and get on the underground into the city centre, or you can stay on the train and it will bring you all the way to Edinburgh if you want, or London. And the buses are integrated into that as well. The Strathclyde Passenger Transport Executive, as it was, created a system in Glasgow. Nobody who can help it takes their car in. And when I lived in Glasgow, we took the train in every day rather than drive into the city. But we need more park and ride schemes. We need more imagination from city planners about what they're going to do. The tram has been a huge success in Edinburgh, and I think will continue to be a huge success in Edinburgh. I love it. It's I went off public transport for years, much to my chagrin and my daughter's anger, but I do love the tram. It's efficient, it gets you where you want to go, and it doesn't get caught up in the traffic. The traffic's got to get out its way. So I think the 20 mile an hour schemes, people will come round to them. We have them in Edinburgh. And People do come round to it, because if you have it in built-up areas where you have lots of children going to school, for example,
have it outside schools.
That it makes a difference. That makes a huge difference.
It's like where we are here, the whole of Westminster. Yeah. It's not needed in the whole of, particularly when you've got a dual carriageway thing and you're doing 20 miles an hour. It's utterly preposterous.
I agree that there are areas where 20 mile an hour limits don't make sense, but there are other areas where they make absolute sense and they save lives. The difference between hitting a child at 30 and 20
you are right. You are right. Jonathan Romain, the public transport problems in Maidenhead, over to you.
Yes, they're not very good, but I have to tell you, I've just come back from Italy, and I was leading a tour of Italy, actually, and we suddenly realised that actually we were standing in the middle of the road, because in many, many towns up and down Italy, cars are banned, so are coaches. And unless you're a delivery van or you're actually working on a building or something like that, and we just realised, it was safer. The noise levels were down. The fresh air, the air was fresher, and this is clearly the way forward. And there may be some short-term inconvenience, but the long-term gain just has to be the right way forward.
Karan,
with transport, you've got to keep a sense of balance. And I don't think we should go backwards, we should go forwards. The idea is to get people to places quicker and safer, but in a proportionate way. Having 20 miles an hour everywhere is absolutely not necessary. Having cycle lanes, I think, is a very good thing and encouraging cycling. But if you have cycle lanes that are used only at peak times and the rest of the day you see one cyclist an hour, then you're creating gridlock, which is creating pollution, which is lost time, which is losing productivity, which is harming the economy. And the ULEZ, for example, to have that is discriminating against people who can't afford and who need to drive in certain areas. So you can't just ban driving and encourage cycling, encourage public transport, but you need to drive as well. It's a sense of balance and proportion that we've completely lost and we need to retain.
One of the biggest flaws in the ULEZ scheme, of course, was that it didn't have a sufficient scrappage scheme. If you're going to bring in a congestion charge, then you have to think about the effect it's going to have on people and how you mitigate that. Glasgow, they had this ridiculous situation where charity vans were having to pay the congestion charge, and then they discovered that, I can't remember the percentage, but a huge percentage of their own vans didn't meet the requirements for the congestion charge. So you've got to do it. If you're going to do that, you have to do it properly, and you have to have proper scrappage schemes, compensation, and a way of people being able to afford it.
It's worth saying, incidentally, I'm chairing a commission report for the Independent Transport Commission on the really damaging effect on people on low incomes, particularly outside London, funnily enough, where the car is absolutely the only way they can get to a job.
Yes.
And incidentally, we're finding quite a lot of cases where the car isn't taxed. It's always carrying 4 or 5 passengers. It generally doesn't have an MOT or whatever, but it's, just frankly, they've just got to get to the job. Now, that's a real issue. So when we start talking about translation to EVs and we start talking about people having to spend an awful lot more on their vehicles, that's a real issue. There's an equity issue there, which is not, I'm afraid, as yet involved. And for me, the issue around ULEZ, quite apart from the fact that we now know that in practice it makes absolutely no difference to air quality, is the fact that here is a Labour mayor who is actually taxing poor people, not rich people, not me. My cars qualify if I were to overuse them, which, as I say, I simply don't. But if I did, I don't have a problem. Poor people do. If that was a Tory saying, I'm going to tax poor people because they deserve it, they're probably just not working hard enough, we'd be pilloried to the world's end. This is a Labour mayor doing it. Don't you worry. Come the next election in May, this is still going to be huge.
Hashtag safer with Susan.
Hashtag safer with Susan. Yes,
right. Erica is in Birmingham. She's got a text question. I'm going to ask you for short answers on this one because we're running out of time. Amazon intends to start using drones in the UK to fly customer orders to them in under an hour. Does the panel think this is progress, or does it just sound too dangerous? Now, Amazon says it will introduce drone deliveries in parts of the UK without saying where by the end of next year. They currently offer this service in 2 US states for parcels which weigh no more than 2.2 kilograms or 5 pounds. I mean, technology is a wonderful thing, but I can't imagine how this can't go wrong. Karan?
Home delivery is something that has rocketed, and it was turbocharged by the pandemic, And it actually hasn't, it's receded a bit, but it's still very popular, whether it's for food or whether it's for your supermarket deliveries. And this is something that is, advancement in technology is bound to happen. It's down the road. It's something that's always been talked about futuristically. This is going to happen before driverless cars. And driverless cars is another thing that people keep talking about, whereas this is proven in America that they've been able to do it. Of course, it's got to be done carefully and safely.
But and also, there are many advantages, obviously, to this, but there's also disadvantages, like loss of employment, like loss of social contact, and also the loss of local shops. So there comes a cost to the advantages.
Christine?
I won't be ordering anything fragile from Amazon if this is...
Do you now?
Oh, that's a good question. No, I don't think I do, actually. But, you know, I can't imagine anybody saying, I'm going to buy a wedding present for my niece. I'll get Amazon to deliver it by drone if they've ordered.
The practicalities of it, I just don't get. Because
they'll be all over the place.
If you live in a terrace street and you the delivery is number 43, well, OK, I suppose... in theory, they can work out where number 43 is, but where does it put it?
Quite.
It can't knock on a door, can it?
No. No, I mean, it's ludicrous in so many ways. In an urban environment, what if you're on the 23rd floor? That'll be interesting. How do they get to there?
Knock on the window.
Knock on the window. But the rotor blade just, giving the gentle wake up. But if you were to think of it in the context of rural delivery, it would be fuel efficient, it would be energy efficient, it would be climate change neutral. It has a role, not a huge role.
But if you live in the middle of nowhere and your house is in the middle of sort of 3 fields or something, that is your property, the 3 fields plus your house. I mean, does it deliver it in the middle of a field? How does it know where your front door is?
Presumably they go
let's just be clear. In a rural context, there's a role for it. In an urban context, it's ludicrously inappropriate, just as long as we remember those two divisions.
Right, let's move on to our final fun question at the end of the programme with Sandra in Bedford, who says, how many languages do your wonderful panellists speak, and do they regret not knowing more? Were they good language learners at school or pretty hopeless? Now, this is in the light of a report that says Britons want languages taught to GCSE, and we're all ashamed that we don't speak languages because we want to be able to hold a conversation in that language. That's going to be our phone-in the next hour, by the way. Jonathan?
Ich kann nicht sprechen Deutsch, aber ich kann verstehen.
Sehr gut. Sehr gut. Ich liebe dich. Karan?
I think we're very lucky that English is the most popular language in terms of the language of business, and we have an advantage over that. But we should learn many more languages. And I'm very lucky. I was born and brought up in India, so I speak and understand 4 or 5 languages.
4 or 5?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. My mother's about 10. My mother can read and write and speak almost 10 languages.
Christine?
Well, it has been suggested that
I speak Glasgow.
Yeah, it has been suggested that I should master English before I learn anything else. But I think you have to learn the right foreign language. I did French and German at school, and I did a year of French at university. And I was in Spain during recess for a friend's daughter's wedding. And hola was the extent of my Spanish. And I was quite embarrassed about it. Spanish is the 3rd most spoken language in the world, but we don't put an emphasis on it in our schools. And I think if we're learning languages, that's great, but make sure, please, that they're the right ones. And that, French and German, I loved learning, but I haven't used my German outside of visits to Germany, Austria and Switzerland. It hasn't been that useful.
Well, I did a degree in it, and I haven't used it since 1985, really. Steve?
I loved languages. I sometimes regret not having taken it onto university, so I speak pretty good French, reasonable Spanish, and moderate Italian. I never mastered German. I can ask for 2 Bier bitte and so on. That's easy enough.
Very important.
And indeed, dia biro parakalo in Greek, if you really want to add another one. But please don't ask me to go much further.
But it may be that Mandarin is the most useful of all.
Yeah.
Well, Mandarin, Arabic. I mean, those are the 2 languages. If you had kids at school at the moment, those are the 2 that you'd probably go for. Thank you very much indeed to Dr. Jonathan Romain, Steve Norris, Christine Jardine, and Lord Karan Bilimoria. On the panel tomorrow, on Monday, we have the Conservative peer Lord Greenhalgh, the Sun's political journalist Noah Hoffman, the barrister and broadcaster Hashi Mohammed, and we'll bring you another as yet unidentified panellist too, just to keep you on your whatever. Right, in the next hour, we are going to talk about foreign languages. Why are we so useless at them? And according to a new survey, most of us would like to speak a foreign language and we'd like to learn one. Well, there is ample opportunity to learn foreign languages because there are such things as evening classes. And when I finish LBC and when I finish my working career, I think I'm going to teach evening classes because I've always wanted to do that. I've always wanted to learn Dutch myself. It's the most guttural language out there. And the word in German, there's a street name called Herengasse. In Dutch, it's Gergegach. Now, who wouldn't want to be able to pronounce that word? 0345 6060 973. It's almost as bad as Glasgow.
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom, the UK Foreign Office is advising against all travel to Lebanon, which shares a border with Israel. It's also encouraging anyone who's currently there to leave.